Past decades offer up many things that capture the essence of the time. Since the 1960s, there have been countless things that at the time seemed perfect, but through the years, they simply faded away. The must-haves from those analog decades of the 1960s through the 1980s have now been abandoned for newer, faster, or sometimes more compact replacements. So let's take a look back, and if you lived through these years, you will remember many of these abandoned things. The hula hoop became an instant craze in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It was a plastic hoop that could be spun around the waist, arms, and legs. The hula hoop was invented by Arthur Mellon and Richard Nair, and their company Whammo sold over 100 million of them. However, the hula hoop craze that had everyone gyrating their hips fizzled out by the mid-1960s. Hula hoops are of course still around, but it is nothing like its popularity during the early 60s, that saw the toy mentioned in songs by Georgia Gibbs and Alvin and the Chipmunks. During the 1950s and even into the early 1960s, 3D movies became a novelty that ushered in many people to their downtown movie theaters. They would hand out special 3D glasses that would make images on the screen appear to pop out and make you feel like a part of the movie. But the trend didn't last that long, because by the mid-1960s, 3D movies had become too expensive to produce, and audiences had grown somewhat tired of the gimmick. During the 1960s, furniture design took on a futuristic new look, inspired by the space race and the promise of a bright, technology-filled future. Chairs, lamps, and tables began to look more like space capsules and rockets than they did basic furniture. They were made from plastic, fiberglass, and metal in sleek and modern designs that remind us today of the cartoon series The Jetsons, which aired around this same time. As we launched into space in 1968, on our way to the moon, the trend was declining, as people realized the furniture wasn't very comfortable, and it often clashed with the other pieces of furniture in the room. Drive-in movie theaters were a very popular way to watch movies during the 1950s and 1960s. Families found it convenient to pull in their large sedan or station wagon to watch a movie, while enjoying snacks and drinks from the snack bar that were delivered right to your car. This was also really popular among teenagers, and the car culture that arose during the 1950s played its part in making the drive-in theater the place to be on the weekends. As technology advanced during the 1960s, and households everywhere began to have their own color TVs for entertainment, drive-in theaters saw a steep decline, and by the 1970s, they began to disappear altogether, as people gravitated more toward the indoor movie theater for blockbuster movies with superior pictures and sound. The miniskirt was a fashion trend that took off in the later part of the 1960s. It was a short, above-the-knee skirt that showed off a woman's legs, and it was considered a symbol of women's liberation and sexual freedom that rebelled against women's fashion up until that point. The poster child for this skirt was British fashion model Twiggy, who could be seen in just about every magazine wearing them. Also, in 1967, Goldie Hawn debuted on Laugh-In, and she would wear them all the time, inspiring girls to copy the same style. By the 1970s, miniskirts were out, and fashion had once again shifted, this time to a more casual style that often included denim. During the Cold War, the fear of a nuclear attack was very real, and many people took it upon themselves to build fallout shelters in their backyards. These underground bunkers were designed to protect people from the radiation and fallout of a nuclear bomb, and they seemed to be everywhere. There were even instructions and booklets available to help people prepare. Through the 1960s, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were on edge, but by the later part of the 1960s, things had eased up a bit, just enough for people to lose interest in building the underground bunkers. Or at the very least, they felt safer than they had before. The twist was a dance craze that took the world by storm in the early 1960s. It was a simple dance that involved twisting your hips to the beat of the music. The dance was popularized by Chubby Checker's hit cover of the same name, The Twist, in 1960. Exposure for the song on American Bandstand and on the Dick Clark Saturday Night Show helped propel it to the top of the charts. The dance craze had lost its appeal by the mid-1960s, as people moved on to other dance styles like the wah-wah-tusi. During the mid-60s, go-go boots became the perfect footwear to complement any miniskirt. The ultra-mod fashion statement were white, knee-high boots with a low heel and a sleek design. And although the originals were made of patent leather, many of the knockoffs were made of vinyl. Go-go boots were seen as another symbol of women's liberation, and the popular song performed by Nancy Sinatra, "These Boots Are Made for Walkin'," made every girl want a pair. The trend of white knee-high boots didn't last long, and by the early 1970s, people were trading in their go-go boots for platform shoes. Tiki culture officially emerged during the 1950s and reached a peak in the 1960s. It was inspired by the romanticized image of Polynesian culture and featured tropical drinks, Hawaiian shirts, and decor that included bamboo, palm fronds, and tiki idols. There is no doubt that movies and music played a big part in making tiki culture a theme of the 1960s. Hawaii had just become a state. Elvis was starring in Blue Hawaii, and even Disneyland opened the Enchanted Tiki Room. Everyone was getting in on the trend. But by the late 1960s, the style became more kitsch, and just like that, it went from being found everywhere to just another restaurant theme. During the 1950s and 1960s, most households in the United States received their milk through home delivery services. Milkmen would deliver fresh milk to customers in glass bottles, and they were then collected and reused. This was a time when the technology within a kitchen was changing, and grocery stores were evolving into supermarkets, which meant that things like milk became just another thing we could take care of ourselves. The fresh milk that was delivered straight to your house was traded for the convenience of buying milk in cartons, which led to a steep decline in home milk delivery. Soda fountains were a popular place to get a cold drink and hang out with friends in the 1960s. These were basically a counter found in stores where a soda jerk would mix syrups and carbonated water to create a variety of drinks. Soda fountains were often a hub of small-town life. This was where people socialized and talked about the weather, prior to the rise of a fast food revolution that replaced the need for soda fountains. The popularity of canned and bottled drinks also contributed to soda fountains disappearing, most of which occurred by the end of the decade. In the 1960s, pretty much all appliances were available in shades of avocado green, and the popularity of the color was off the charts. Everything from refrigerators to stoves to washing machines went from being pastel during the 1950s to earthy green throughout the 1960s. This color choice did extend into the 1970s, but that's only because they hadn't been replaced yet. Avocado would eventually be traded in for more neutral colors and styles that would rule the 1970s and 1980s. At Recollection Road, I believe preserving the past is incredibly important, and our friends at Legacy Box do too. So much so, they've offered my viewers a code for 55% off. In today's digital age, analog media like VHS tapes and film reels are fading, risking the loss of cherished memories due to things like mold, dust, and time. But Legacy Box, trusted by over 1.5 million families, offers a simple and safe solution to protect your memories before it's too late. With Legacy Box, you can convert your analog treasures into digital memories effortlessly. Send your VHS tapes, camcorder tapes, and pictures to Legacy Box, and like magic, receive back your originals and digital copies for easy enjoyment, sharing, and organization. And here's the kicker. For a limited time, enjoy an exclusive 55% discount at legacybox.com/recollection. Don't let your memories fade. Preserve your past today with Legacy Box. Buy today to take advantage of this exclusive offer and send them in whenever you're ready. Go to legacybox.com/recollection to save 55% while supplies last. Before cell phones, before even digital video cameras, families in the 1970s would record family events using a Super 8 camera. The camera was developed by Kodak and used the same format as motion picture films, so it was popular with amateur movie makers. Super 8 made shooting films easier, more affordable, and more fun than ever before. Super 8s remained popular throughout the 1970s, right up until Betamax and VHS camcorders took over the market. The 1970s is not known for its stellar sense of style. Rather, it is more notorious for introducing fashion trends that many hope we never see again. One of these being short shorts for men. These tight-fitting and hairy leg-showing swatches of fabric were mainly reserved for athletic shorts, so they could easily be found on the basketball court or roller skating through a park. To complement these sporty shorts, tube socks covered the lower half of your legs, and they had stripes that encircled the top. Athletes like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Pele, and Bjorn Borg couldn't get enough of the short shorts and tube sock look, making it even more popular. Fortunately, this trend, along with many others from the 1970s, has faded away. During the 1970s, there was a push to start using the metric system as our universal measuring standard. There was even legislation passed called the Metric Conversion Act, signed into law in 1975 by President Gerald Ford, but it wasn't a mandatory thing. It turns out that Americans weren't ready to switch from inches, miles, and pounds to centimeters, kilometers, and grams. Therefore, the metric push was never adopted. As globalization worked to establish a universally accepted way to measure, we in the US decided that we liked our customary system. Farrah Fawcett single-handedly made feathered hair a national fad, and without it, the 1970s might just be a blur of disco and bell-bottoms. Feathered hair differed from past hairdos, with its breezy blowout that flipped back and away from the face. It just seemed like a more natural look, and teenagers took notice, especially as episodes of Charlie's Angels aired each week, making Farrah an even bigger star. Feathered hair was worn by men and women alike during the 1970s, and although the popularity of the look peaked during this decade, its influence on contemporary hairstyles can still be found. The original Goody's Super Comb was so big and clunky, it almost looked like a weapon. But this trusty hair accessory that could comb through anything became the ultimate fashion accessory during the 1970s. By putting a super comb in your back pocket, all of your friends knew you were serious about keeping your hair looking good. And this became a trend that saw just about everybody doing it. Tab soda was a big seller during the 1970s. The diet soda was produced by Coca-Cola, and they offered a variety of flavors, but the primary sweetener in Tab was saccharin, which became an issue when researchers thought it caused cancer. Despite the label warning about the side effects, Tab remained popular. But the nail in the coffin was the introduction of Diet Coke in 1982. Although Tab was still produced, the drink was scaled back considerably, which created sort of a cult following, but it was nothing like its popularity during the 1970s. Motorcycles, helped by the popularity of Evel Knievel and the movie Easy Rider, were the inspiration for bicycle designs of the 1970s. Not only did bikes have chopper-style handlebars, but they also had long seats, called banana seats. This style was introduced by Schwinn in 1963, and kids everywhere went crazy for them. By the 1970s, if you didn't have a bike with raised handlebars and a banana seat, you were missing out. The bikes carried over a little into the 1980s, but by then, BMX and freestyle bikes were the new thing. Every kid loved collecting cards, but during the 1970s, it wasn't baseball cards kids were buying. Wacky packs were hilarious spoof cards that made fun of consumer products of the day. The artwork was drawn by some of the decade's best-known artists, and kids couldn't get enough of the hilarious cards. The 1970s was when Wacky packs were at their peak, but these funny trading cards would end up fizzling out, especially after kids got their hands on the even more offensive Garbage Pail Kids of the 1980s. Children's television in the 1970s would not be the same without the wild visuals of Sid and Marty Croft. Shows like H.R. Pufnstuf, Land of the Lost, and The Bugaloos had millions of American kids smiling on Saturday mornings. These fantastical shows featured the signature style of large-headed puppets and low-budget special effects, which made the world of Sid and Marty Croft one that kids would remember for a lifetime. Teenagers from the 1970s wanted one car more than any other. The Pontiac Trans Am became one of the most popular muscle cars of the decade, and the movie Smokey and the Bandit helped to catapult it even further. For kids in the 1970s, the Trans Am embodied everything they could ever want in a car. The Firebird decal on the hood, the shaker scoop, and those comfortable bucket seats made for one of the most iconic cars of the 1970s. Who could forget the novelty phones that every kid wanted for their bedroom? From Garfield to Mickey Mouse, these clunky landlines injected personality into our rooms. When a call came through, these phones had features that would make them worth every penny. Some would light up, while others would open their eyes when the handset was picked up. These phones were pretty common Christmas gifts during this time, and it also had kids begging for their own phone line too. Fitness classes during the 1980s became part of just about every mom's VHS collection. There were countless celebrity workouts, including Raquel Welch, Suzanne Summers, and of course, Jane Fonda. Decked out in leg warmers and leotards, Jane Fonda sold a number of workout videos which made her a fortune. These videos were more than just exercise. They were a cultural phenomenon, and they even had moms buying their first VCR just so they could work out at home. These workout tapes were some of the first examples of on-demand fitness, and they capitalized on the fame and beauty of their spokesperson, and it also helped them to become a part of classic 1980s nostalgia. Remember the 1980s tracksuit? These colorful and slick outfits were a testament to 1980s fashion. They were basically windbreakers for the entire body, and they made you feel like you were ready for any adventure. Some people called them shell suits, and they were popular with the breakdancing culture and the wannabes of the time. Although they've made sporadic comebacks over the years, they will forever remain a symbol of the 1980s aesthetic that is so recognizable. Recollection Road is proud to partner with Legacy Box. Watch until the end of this video to find out more about digitizing your family's irreplaceable memories, and then visit legacybox.com/recollection for an incredible 55% off. Do you happen to recall the crimped hair trend that swept the 1980s? It was a hairstyle that demanded patience and dedication, because you meticulously used a crimping iron to create a corrugated texture in your hair. This frizzy look was right up there with the poofy and high bangs when it came to popularity. The crimping iron became yet another tool that might be found in that caboodle case. The hairstyles of the 1980s were just about as bold as our ambitions. Late-night TV was littered with infomercials that promised to unlock life's secrets through mysterious 1-900 numbers. It was a time when the unknown drew us in, whether it was seeking psychic insights or even indulging in a little adult chat. These hotlines had many people dialing away. They were even geared towards kids, with options to speak to your favorite TV and movie characters. These calls racked up the charges, making getting your phone bill the worst part of the whole experience. There was no better way to beat the heat of summer than to break out the Snoopy snow cone machine. It was a toy and a kitchen gadget that made shaving the ice and drizzling it with colorful syrup a joy for kids. It was exciting to drop the ice cubes in the chute, press down on the Snoopy ice pusher, and crank the handle to fill up your tiny cup with snow. Looking back, the paper cups were pretty tiny, and it only came with one flavor of syrup. so the novelty of the machine would wear off pretty fast, but nonetheless it is something that reminds us of the 1980s. Remember sitting in class and having an overhead projector positioned in front of the pull-down screen? The transparent sheets were filled with lessons from just about every subject, from taking notes to solving math problems. This piece of equipment helped the teacher guide us through each class. The assortment of colorful markers would fill up the stack of transparencies and would then need to be cleaned off so they could be used again. They were staples in just about every classroom in the 1980s, and they led to the chalkboard being used less and less. In the 1980s, Casio calculator watches were the must-have device for the academic-minded kid, blending both timekeeping and math problem solving. These wristwatches were some of the first to include a backlight, calendar, and even data storage. These were the top-of-the-line watches of the time. Today, our smartphones can tackle calculations like this with ease, making those calculator watches just a charming reminder of the 1980s. In the 80s, the arcade was a hallowed haven for gamers. From classic video games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, to the bells and buzzers of pinball machines, these arcades were the ultimate hangout spots. There was nothing better than the sound of quarters jingling and joysticks rocking back and forth. There was a thrill to playing games at the arcade. Maybe it was waiting your turn to play your favorite machine, or that desire to get your name on the leaderboard. Either way, it was a special feeling that home gaming consoles couldn't really replicate. For some, the thrill of those classic arcades were the best part of growing up in the 1980s. The days of home movie making were a bit different back in the 1980s. We used to lug around those hefty shoulder camcorders to capture those precious family moments. It was a big production to record on these cameras, from loading in the VHS tape to using the eyepiece and adjusting the focus. There was a lot to control on these bulky devices. They were expensive too, so it was a pretty big deal when Dad brought one home. The shopping mall was the social hub of the 1980s. It was where friends would meet up and spend an entire Saturday roaming around. There was nothing better than hanging out in the food court, stopping by your favorite stores, and maybe catching a movie or playing some arcade games. The 1980s was the pinnacle of malls dominating the suburban shopping experience. It's really hard to believe that these places have fallen so far. There were so many special places within the mall that still evoke great memories of our younger days. Last but not least, who can forget the excitement of the Publishers Clearinghouse Sweepstakes, with the prize patrol delivering oversized checks to lucky winners. Those large envelopes in the mail enticed us to sign up for more magazine subscriptions than we knew what to do with, and the commercials showing the surprised winners gave us all hope that we could win too. The 1980s was loaded with moments that perfectly represent the time. The Afterschool special is one of these moments. ABC dreamt up the idea and it aired the moral teaching movies throughout the entirety of the decade. The other big channels got in on it too, with NBC's Special Treat and CBS's School Break Special. The topics covered everything imaginable, from drugs to divorce, but generally they tried to teach kids life lessons. The specials were also known for their attention-grabbing titles, which had kids jumping off the bus, grabbing a snack, and flipping on the TV throughout the 1980s. The late 1980s was dominated by time spent at the mall. One of the most memorable stores at the mall was the Glamour Shots Studio. This is where you could go to have a celebrity-type photo shoot, with over-the-top makeup, props, and of course, the airbrushing effects. These photos weren't cheap either, with hundreds of dollars being shelled out for just one session. But nonetheless, women loved it, and the company continued to grow into the 1990s. The Glamour Shots style was pretty iconic, but it also was easily dated, which is why it has faded into obscurity. Shoe stores like Tom McCann and Kinney's Shoes were the place to go before every store sold shoes. Shoe salesmen would help you find that perfect pair of shoes, and then manually measure your foot to check your size. They would then disappear into the back and finally bring you a perfectly fitted pair of shoes that they would help you into with the assistance of their special stool and maybe even a shoehorn. Today, there is much less emphasis on serving customers in this way, and so you have to try on shoes yourself to find the pair that fits the best. Ever since the late 1980s, when the waterbed hit its peak, it's been slowly disappearing from the American home. The waterbed became a new way to sleep during the 1970s, and it was popular with bachelors. It was during the 1980s that it successfully made the leap to the suburban bedroom, and by 1987, 1 out of 5 mattresses purchased in the US were waterbeds. The real problems with waterbeds was the installation and setup, and the difficulty in moving a waterbed was even more complicated. Plus, there was always the fear of your mattress springing a leak, which is why the waterbed has pretty much vanished from bedrooms. The video rental store was the way many of us kicked off our weekends during the 1980s. There was something special about the evenings perusing the new releases and horror sections, and you would usually walk out of there with a stack of movies to keep you busy all weekend. Stores like Blockbuster, Family Video, and Hollywood Video were among the most common, but there were also countless small local video stores that served up movies to the masses. Getting your own membership card, remembering to rewind all the VHS tapes, and paying the late charges were all part of the experience. Today, on-demand streaming services have made video rental stores obsolete, but for many, those trips to rent movies were half the fun. The VCR era that made video rentals so popular also made recording onto blank VHS tapes a big deal. Not only could you record your favorite TV show, but you could also use your camcorder to record home movies. Those wood-paneled drawer boxes were where we stored them all, and often there were multiple things recorded on the same tape, so it was sometimes hard to find what you were looking for. You might also remember adjusting the tracking on the VCR to get the picture just right. Recording on these VHS tapes is a thing of the past, and nowadays, if you want to record a video, you just take out your cell phone. There are few advertisements that are as memorable as the As Seen on TV commercials of the 1980s. The clapper was one of the biggest selling gadgets during this time, and it allowed you to control lights with the clap of your hands. Their catchy jingle stuck with you, and it also saved you from having to get out of bed to switch off the light, which made it convenient for older people. The sound-activated switch plugged into an existing outlet and had 2 spots to plug things in, and so these devices made great Christmas gifts. Although you can still buy a clapper today, there is no denying that the 1980s was when the clapper was in its prime. When you flip through an old 1980s yearbook, one of the things that really sticks out, or up, rather, is the hair and bangs of teenage girls. The higher you could make it, the better, and Aquanet hairspray was what kept everything nice and stiff. Taking cues from the hairbands of the day, teasing, spraying, and blow-drying is what kept household bathrooms occupied for hours, while little brothers waited. The huge hair fad would end with the decade, and it gave way to the alternative grunge style of the 1990s, but not before it solidified itself as the hair that defined the 1980s. If you were one of the ones that rocked the big hair, then you most likely also gave shoulder pads a try. These foam fashion statements were meant to give women a sharp, defined silhouette that rivaled the suits and ties worn by men. The 1980s primetime soap Dynasty loved the look, as it gave the actresses a distinct V shape which was slimming. The squared-off shoulder look went well with the brightly colored clothing and the 1980s aesthetics, but quickly fell out of style as the decade ended. There were many mail-order tape clubs during the 1980s, but Columbia House is the one that I remember best. This was a way to get a dozen albums for pennies, which sounded too good to be true, so it had many of us signing up. The only catch was that you were billed at full price for future required purchases that sometimes came as a surprise. Columbia House would also send you their selections of the month, and sometimes it was easier just to pay for them than it was to send them back. The novelty of the club wore off pretty quickly though, especially once the bills started rolling in for all the tapes you decided to keep. Let me know in the comments if I missed any of your favorite things that we have now abandoned. And make sure to check the description of this video for links to pick up a t-shirt and sign up for the newsletter. Thank you to our loyal Patreon supporters listed here. Visit patreon.com/recollectionroad to join the club. As always, thank you so much for watching.